The first thing I remember after it happened wasn't the silence. It was the way everyone suddenly found something else to look at. The florist stared at the floor. My best man started adjusting his tie for the 10th time. Even the officiant coughed and pretended to reread the ceremony. And I just stood there, still holding my fiancée's hands. She had smiled at me with tears in her eyes, taken a shaky breath, and whispered, "I can't wait to spend the rest of my life with you." Daniel. My name isn't Daniel. For a second I honestly thought I'd misheard her. Weddings are loud. People sniffle, babies cry, chairs creak. My brain tried desperately to replace the word with my actual name. It couldn't. Her face lost all color the instant she realized what she'd said. No. I meant. She stopped herself. That tiny pause lasted maybe 2 seconds. It destroyed everything. Before that moment, I would have told anyone I was the luckiest man alive. We had been together for 4 years. We owned a little house that always smelled like coffee and vanilla candles. We argued over stupid things like where to hang pictures and whose turn it was to feed the dog, but never about anything that mattered. At least that's what I believed. Looking back now, I hate how many memories have changed shape. Things I once called harmless suddenly look like warning signs I chose not to see. And I keep wondering if the worst day of my life actually started years before anyone walked down that aisle. People always ask if I stopped the ceremony immediately. I didn't. That's the part I'm still ashamed of. When she whispered, "I meant you," she squeezed my hand so tightly it almost hurt. Her smile looked glued to her face, desperate and terrified at the same time. Everyone was waiting for my reaction. I laughed. Not because I thought it was funny. Because my brain refused to accept what had just happened. "It's just nerves," I said loud enough for everyone to hear. A few guests chuckled. The officiant smiled with obvious relief. My mother wiped away tears, believing we'd escaped an awkward moment. Only my fiancée didn't look relieved. She looked trapped. The ceremony continued, but everything sounded distant, like I was underwater. I repeated my vows automatically while watching her instead of listening to the words coming out of my own mouth. She couldn't hold eye contact anymore. Every few seconds her gaze drifted toward the third row of seats. I followed it once. A man I'd met only twice before was sitting there. He didn't smile. He looked like someone attending a funeral instead of a wedding. I tried convincing myself I was imagining things. After all, people say strange things under pressure. Brides faint. Grooms forget their vows. Calling someone by the wrong name could happen, couldn't it? That was the story I repeated to myself through the reception. She stayed close to me the entire evening, almost unnaturally close. Every time someone pulled her away for photos or congratulations, she hurried back as if she was afraid to leave me alone with my own thoughts. I noticed other things too. She barely touched her food. She checked her phone constantly, turning the screen away whenever I glanced over. And every time I spotted that man from the ceremony, she seemed to know exactly where he was without looking. I'd met him through one of her co-workers months earlier. His name really was Daniel. We'd exchanged handshakes, talked about football for 5 minutes, and that was it. Or so I believed. Late that night, after the last guests left, I finally asked the question that had been burning inside me. "So, why did you call me Daniel?" She froze with one shoe in her hand. For a few seconds, she didn't even look at me. Then she forced out a laugh that sounded painfully rehearsed. "I told you. I was nervous. I waited." Normally, she filled silence with jokes or random stories. That night she just stood there, avoiding my eyes. "You're seriously going to let one word ruin today?" she asked. It wasn't just one word. It was a mistake. "Then why did you look terrified?" She rubbed both hands over her face. "I embarrassed myself in front of everyone. That's why." The explanation sounded reasonable enough that I almost accepted it. Almost. Then her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She grabbed it so quickly it startled me. Too quickly. She turned away while reading the message, but not before I caught a single line lighting up the screen. "I'm sorry. I never should have come." No name. No emoji. Nothing else. She deleted the notification before I could ask about it. That was the first time in our relationship that I realized she was actively hiding something from me. And once that thought entered my mind, it refused to leave. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard her voice saying another man's name with absolute certainty. It wasn't hesitant or confused. It sounded natural, like a habit she didn't realize she still had. By morning, she'd become unusually affectionate. She made breakfast, kissed my forehead, suggested we spend the weekend away together. A week earlier I would have thought it was sweet. Now it felt like damage control. I hated myself for becoming suspicious overnight, but I couldn't switch it off. While she was in the shower, her phone buzzed again on the nightstand. I stared at it. For nearly a minute I argued with myself. We had always trusted each other. We'd never checked each other's phones. Crossing that line felt wrong. Then another notification appeared. "Please tell me you told him." My stomach dropped. Before I could read anything else, I heard the water stop running. I put the phone back exactly where it had been. She walked into the bedroom wrapped in a towel, smiling as if everything was normal. I smiled back. It was the first lie I told my wife, less than 24 hours after our wedding. For the next 3 days, I became someone I didn't recognize. I watched instead of trusted. Every little detail started feeling significant. She carried her phone everywhere, even to the laundry room. She tilted the screen away whenever a message arrived. At night, she waited until she thought I was asleep before replying to someone in complete silence. I wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation. Instead, I kept replaying the wedding in my head. On the fourth evening, she left to help a coworker through a rough breakup. Normally, I wouldn't have questioned it. This time, something inside me refused to stay home. I followed her. I hated myself the entire drive. She didn't go to her coworker's apartment. She parked outside a quiet neighborhood cafe just before closing. 10 minutes later, Daniel walked in through the opposite entrance. Neither of them hugged. Neither of them kissed. They simply sat across from each other with the exhausted look of two people carrying the same secret for far too long. I stayed in my car, staring through the window. Then I watched her begin to cry. I couldn't hear a single word they were saying, but I didn't need to. Daniel reached across the table, and she grabbed his hand without hesitation. Not like coworkers. Not like old friends. Like two people who had done it 100 times before. Something inside me snapped. I walked into the cafe before I had time to think. The bell above the door rang, and both of them looked up at the exact same moment. She went completely pale. Daniel slowly pulled his hand away, but it was already too late. "What is this?" I asked. Neither of them answered. "I ask you a question." She stood so quickly her chair nearly tipped over. "I can explain." "Great. Start talking." Daniel opened his mouth first. "This isn't what you think." I laughed because that sentence felt almost insulting. "I watched my wife hold your hand. She called me by your name at our wedding. Tell me what I'm supposed to think." People at nearby tables had stopped pretending not to listen. She started crying harder. "I never wanted you to find out like this." Those words hit me harder than anything else. Not "there's nothing to find out." Not "you're mistaken." She just admitted there really was something to confess. We left the cafe without finishing the conversation. She begged me not to make a scene, so I walked outside before I completely lost my temper. Daniel stayed behind for a minute, giving us space, or maybe giving himself time to disappear. The drive home was painfully quiet. She cried almost the entire way, wiping her face with shaking hands, while I kept both eyes on the road because I couldn't bear to look at her. When we finally pulled into the driveway, I turned off the engine. "Tell me everything." She stared through the windshield for what felt like forever. "I met Daniel before I met you." "I know that much." "No. I loved him." The words landed like a punch. "He ended things because he was moving away. We stopped talking. Months later, I met you." I thought that chapter of my life was over. I swallowed hard. "So why was he at our wedding?" She closed her eyes. "Because he came back 6 months ago." "And you never thought to mention that?" "I was afraid of what it would do to us." Instead, her silence had already done it. I wanted to believe that was the whole story. An old boyfriend came back. Old feelings resurfaced. She got confused. It was ugly, but maybe it was still something we could survive. Then I asked the question I had been avoiding. "Have you slept with him?" She didn't answer. She just cried harder. That silence told me everything. I felt physically sick. "How long?" "A few months," she whispered. "A few months before the wedding?" She nodded without looking at me. I stood up so fast the chair crashed into the wall. "You let me stand in front of our families and promise forever while you were sleeping with someone else?" I wanted to end it. "When?" "Before the wedding." "But you didn't." She buried her face in her hands. I kept telling myself one more conversation, one more goodbye, one more chance to walk away. Then everything got bigger than I knew how to stop. I laughed again, but there wasn't any humor left. "So when you said his name, you weren't thinking about your past?" She shook her head. "I'd seen him that morning." Every memory from our wedding instantly became contaminated. Every smile. Every photograph. Every promise. I left the house before I said something I couldn't take back. I drove for hours with no destination, pulling over twice because my hands were shaking too badly to stay on the road. My phone kept vibrating. Calls from her. Messages from my parents. My best man. Even her sister. Apparently, she had already told them that something terrible had happened. By the time I checked my voicemail, everyone knew we had separated. No one knew why. When I finally answered my older brother's call, he listened without interrupting. After a long silence, he quietly asked, "Are you absolutely sure?" I almost got angry. Then I realized he wasn't defending her. He just couldn't imagine someone going through with a wedding while having an affair. Neither could I. When I returned home the next afternoon, half her clothes were gone. She had left a handwritten letter on the kitchen table. It began with the words, "You deserved the truth long before the wedding." For the first time since everything fell apart, I was afraid to keep reading, because I knew the next few pages would hurt even more than everything I'd already heard. I read the letter 3 times before it finally sank in. She wrote that every time she tried to end things with Daniel, he reminded her of the life they had planned years earlier. He wasn't forcing her to stay. He wasn't manipulating her. The painful truth was simpler than that. She couldn't let go. According to her, the affair had started just once after they unexpectedly ran into each other at a conference. She regretted it immediately, yet she kept meeting him because every goodbye felt unfinished. Then came the sentence that made my stomach turn. "I almost called off the wedding the night before." Almost. Instead, she'd smiled for photographers, hugged our families, and walked toward me knowing she was carrying a secret that could destroy us. She apologized over and over, writing that I had never failed her, never neglected her, never given her a reason to look elsewhere. There wasn't a single excuse in the letter. Just admissions. Somehow, that made it worse. If I had done something terrible, I could have blamed myself. Instead, I was left with the unbearable realization that love alone hadn't been enough. The weeks that followed felt unreal. People kept congratulating us because the wedding photos were still appearing on social media. Friends who hadn't attended sent messages saying we looked perfect together. I couldn't bring myself to answer any of them. Eventually, rumors started spreading. Some people assumed I'd cheated. Others thought we'd argued about money or children. Only our immediate families knew the truth, and even then, they didn't know every detail. My parents were furious. Her parents were devastated. Her mother called me one evening, crying so hard I could barely understand her. She apologized for her daughter's choices again and again, as if somehow she had raised her to betray me. I told her none of this was her fault. Then I hung up and cried myself. That surprised me. I wasn't crying because I wanted my wife back. I was grieving the future I'd spent 4 years building in my head. The children we'd named. The vacations we'd planned. The ordinary life I thought was guaranteed. Losing a relationship hurt. Losing the version of the future I believed in hurt even more. About 2 months later, she asked to meet one last time. I almost refused. Curiosity won. We met in a quiet park where we had one of our first dates. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. She looked exhausted, thinner than I remembered, with dark circles under her eyes. I ended things with Daniel, she said before I could speak. I didn't know what response she expected. Congratulations? Sympathy? Hope? Instead, I simply nodded. He wasn't the reason I came, she continued. I came because I needed you to know I never stopped loving you. I looked at her for a long moment. You loved me enough to marry me. Yes. But not enough to be honest. She closed her eyes. No. There it was. The simplest, most truthful sentence she'd spoken since all this began. She asked if there was any chance we could start over. I wanted to say yes. Part of me still recognized the woman I'd laughed with for years. But another part knew I'd spend every ordinary day wondering if another secret was waiting behind another smile. That wasn't a marriage. It was a prison built from doubt. The divorce was surprisingly quick. There were no children, no complicated finances, and, by that point, very little left to fight over. We split the furniture almost mechanically. She kept the house because she'd put more money into the down payment. I took the dog because we both knew he followed me everywhere anyway. The hardest part wasn't signing the papers. It was erasing the small routines that had quietly become my life. I'd still wake up expecting to hear her making coffee. I'd catch myself buying her favorite cereal at the grocery store before remembering there was no reason to. For months, I avoided weddings altogether. Even hearing someone practice vows in a movie made my chest tighten. People kept telling me I'd move on. I did. Eventually. But moving on isn't the same as forgetting. Trust stopped feeling automatic. Every new relationship began with invisible walls I never used to have. I hated that she'd changed something so fundamental inside me. She didn't just break my heart. She rewrote the way I looked at love, commitment, and even my own instincts. It's been several years now, and I still think about that single word. Not every day. But often enough. Sometimes people ask why my engagement ended, and I usually give them the shortened version. She fell in love with someone else. It's easier than explaining how an entire life unraveled because of one accidental name spoken at exactly the wrong moment. I've replayed that ceremony thousands of times in my head. If she'd said my name correctly, would I have lived for years without ever knowing? Would we have had children before the truth surfaced? Would she have eventually confessed, or would the affair have become another buried secret? I'll never know. Oddly enough, I'm grateful she slipped. The truth was devastating, but a lifetime built on deception would have been worse. I don't hate her anymore. I don't even hate Daniel. What I hate is how easy it is to mistake comfort for certainty and trust for proof. If there's one lesson I've carried forward, it's this: when something deep inside you tells you that reality doesn't match the story you're being given, Don't silence that voice just because the truth might ruin your plans. Sometimes the smallest mistake reveals the biggest lie.